Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi there, Herman and Corn. So my wife and I are, if you wondered why there's been a lot of prompts about urbanism this morning, you have your answer. We're sitting in traffic on the way to Tel Aviv, and we were listening to the beginning of your episode about Hermanville, where you talk about if you, Herman Poppleberry, were starting a new town in Israel from scratch, what would you do? What would be your first policy moves? And you mentioned that your first thing would be, and this is actually really interesting to me that you jumped at this first, and my wife is, I'm sure, delighted to hear it, that you would make it a person first space. We touched upon this in the episode about Vienna, where we talked about the formal hierarchy of users, where they actually have a defined system for this. But I don't think that needs to be necessarily a doctrine that's kind of instituted, although it's quite deterministic, I guess, if you do that. But just this concept you mentioned, the way you put it was very interesting to me, that we build spaces, and you mentioned even new spaces in Israel, which is absolutely true, like Modi'in, where we're still wedded to this idea of let's build infrastructure, then put people around the side, which is really weird when you think about it. So my question, Herman and Corn, is I've always wanted to ask this in the context of our discussions about reducing cars on the road and all the rest of it, is can we actually achieve a car-free society? Is that a feasible goal? I'm going to give you my thoughts on the matter, and then I'd like you to tell me what you think of them in terms of, are they actually have these challenges been explored? The first is that if we take away cars entirely, my feeling is that this is a choice that is not going to be a choice eventually, and that's why I say that my personal feeling is that even electric vehicles are just a stopgap. They're less polluting, but they're still ultimately unsustainable. I think human society, are going to have to say, well, it's actually not sustainable. Sorry, we've looked at it. We can't have individual users in their own boxes moving about the place. It's just, if we do that, we're going to have to build these roads everywhere, and we're never going to get past this car first way of planning if we're not willing to accept that this may not be a sustainable luxury. The other thing we're going to have to do, if we do that, is radically improve public transport in terms of its scale, capacity, and its reach. And that's a question I'd really like to explore, because if we have a car-free society with public transport, traditionally we're looking at public transport and stuff like rail lines being put down where it's worth putting them down. So if you have a remote community of only a few thousand people, it's not going to be worth the cost of operating or putting down that infrastructure. So it doesn't mean that we have to give up on these really small communities. It doesn't mean that there'd be a certain threshold that we just say, if you live on your own, there's not going to be a road anymore to your house. Do we even need to talk about flying cars and hovercraft and all these space age technologies that have never come to fruition yet? Or can the tools we have, like the train, etc., actually just do the job? The only other question I have about this, Herman and Corn, that's a pretty big one, because it would radically change how we live, and it would require a totally scaled up type of infrastructure that we haven't even considered yet. Instead of connecting major cities like we have in Israel, we have to try to connect really everywhere where there's a decent collection of humans to make it viable. Otherwise, we're going to just force people to live in only a few cities. The other question I have, Herman and Corn, is when I think about, could this actually work, is especially when you go to Vienna, one of the most interesting examples of unconventional transport in the world. You notice, I think one of the things that I found entertaining is that you have ambulances, and they're not gondoliers, they're using motors, because even in Venice, you have to, when there's a life on the line, you're not going to row at a slow pace. So there's always going to be that category, I think, of people on the road, whether we're talking about emergency services or we talked about even motorcades before, and president, where we're going to have to give priority to. And my question is, if we do, that to me is a real challenge, because we don't want to have a whole road network reserved for just occasional use. And how could that work? So Herman and Corn, those are what the challenges that occur to me are inherent to this idea. But I'd love to hear whether there's any country in the world where that's maybe at the more radical side of the anti-car debate. We're not just talking about reducing cars, we're talking about actually an intentional policy whose end goal is unashamedly doing away with the car and private transport altogether, and radically overhauling and scaling up public transport to connect us. Herman and Corn, let's talk about whether a car-free world is actually viable, and a policy anyone's actually targeting in 2026, I'm sorry. Over to you two.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my weird prompts. I am Corn, and I have to say, today's topic feels particularly relevant because our housemate Daniel actually sent this one in while he was sitting in gridlock on the way to Tel Aviv. There is nothing like a 2-hour commute for a 40-minute drive to make you question the entire foundation of modern civilization, right?
I can practically feel the frustration through the audio prompt. Herman Poppleberry here, and it is that classic urbanist realization: you are not stuck in traffic, you are the traffic. Daniel is hitting on a nerve that has been vibrating in urban planning circles for a while now. The idea that maybe the personal automobile, regardless of what is under the hood, is a failed experiment for high-density living.
It is a bold premise. Daniel is essentially asking if we can just quit cars cold turkey. Not just gas guzzlers, but the whole concept of the individual vehicle. He is skeptical about electric vehicles being the ultimate savior, and I think he has a point there. But the logistics of a truly car-free society, especially when you get outside of a city center, those are some massive hurdles.
They are huge. But before we get to the hurdles, we have to look at why people like Daniel are reaching this breaking point. We have spent the last 80 years or so redesigning the entire world to accommodate a very specific type of machine. If you look at most modern cities, between 30 and 50% of the land area is dedicated to cars. That is roads, parking lots, driveways, and gas stations. We have basically built our habitats for cars and then invited humans to live in the gaps.
And that is what Daniel was mentioning about our previous discussion on Hermanville and the city of Vienna. This idea of a person-first space. But let us tackle his first point about electric vehicles. Why is it that even in 26, with electric vehicle adoption higher than ever, we are still seeing this push to eliminate them entirely? If they are not emitting tailpipe CO2, what is the problem?
It is what urbanists call the geometry problem. An electric vehicle takes up the same amount of physical space as a combustion engine vehicle. If you have 10,000 people trying to get to the same city center at 8 in the morning, and they are all in individual 2-ton metal boxes, you have a traffic jam. It does not matter if those boxes are powered by gasoline, electricity, or fairy dust. The throughput of a standard traffic lane is only about 2,000 people per hour if everyone is in a car. Compare that to a dedicated bus lane which can do 10,000, or a rail line that can do 50,000.
Right, so it is a space efficiency issue. But there is also the sustainability side. I remember reading that the environmental impact of building a car, especially the battery components for electric vehicles, is massive.
That is the key thing. It is the embodied carbon. To build a single long-range electric vehicle battery, you are mining and processing tons of lithium, cobalt, and nickel. Then there is the tire wear. By 26, data has shown that tire wear is actually the leading source of primary microplastics in our environment. Because electric vehicles are generally 20 to 30% heavier due to the batteries, they actually produce more tire wear particles and road dust than internal combustion cars. So, while they solve the local air quality issue regarding exhaust, they do not solve the resource extraction problem, the microplastic problem, or the congestion problem.
So Daniel is right. Electric vehicles are a step, but they are not the finish line. But then we get to his big question: how do we actually scale up public transport to the point where a car becomes unnecessary? I mean, we live in Jerusalem. We have the light rail, we have buses, but people still cling to their cars because the reach is not always there.
Well, it requires a total shift in how we fund and perceive transit. For the last century, we have treated roads as a public good, funded by taxes, and transit as a business that needs to break even or at least justify its subsidies. To get to a car-free society, you have to flip that. You have to treat high-frequency, high-capacity transit as the primary infrastructure like water or electricity.
But that brings up the cost issue Daniel mentioned. Building a subway system is astronomically expensive. Even light rail is a huge investment. If we are talking about a radical policy to eliminate private transport, are we talking about a world where every tiny village has a train station?
Probably not. And that is where the remote community challenge comes in. This is the hardest part of the car-free dream. If you live in a village of 500 people in the Galilee or the mountains of Vermont, a train every 15 minutes is a financial impossibility. The infrastructure cost per user would be tens of thousands of dollars.
So what is the solution there? Do those people just get left behind? Or do we force everyone to move into megacities?
That is the fear, right? The death of the rural lifestyle. But there are middle grounds that we are seeing explored more in 25 and 26. It is called Mobility as a Service, or MaaS. Instead of everyone owning a car that sits idle 95% of the time, you have a publicly managed fleet of smaller, modular, potentially autonomous shuttles. In a rural area, you might not have a bus route, but you have an on-demand service. You use an app, a shuttle arrives at your door within 10 minutes, and it takes you to the nearest regional transit hub.
So it is like a public version of a ride-sharing app, but integrated into the larger transit network.
That is right. And because it is part of the public infrastructure, it is coordinated. The shuttle knows exactly when the regional train is arriving, so the transfer is seamless. You are not waiting an hour on a cold platform. This is what the Swiss do incredibly well with their Postbus and Pulse system. Every train, bus, and boat in the country is timed to meet at specific intervals. It creates a virtual spider web of connectivity that makes a car feel like a burden rather than a freedom.
That word freedom is interesting. For a lot of people, the car is the ultimate symbol of autonomy. I can go anywhere, anytime. How do you overcome that psychological barrier?
You replace it with the freedom of not having to worry about it. Think about the freedom of being able to read a book, sleep, or work while you travel. Think about the freedom of not having a $400 monthly car payment, plus insurance, plus maintenance, plus the stress of finding parking. When the transit is frequent enough, say every 5 to 7 minutes, you stop looking at a schedule. You just walk to the station. That is a different kind of freedom.
I want to go back to the emergency services point Daniel raised. This is a very practical concern. If you get rid of the traditional road network, how does the ambulance get to your house? How does the fire truck reach a burning building? You mentioned the ambulances in Venice, which are boats, but not every city has canals.
This is a common misconception about car-free cities. Car-free usually means car-light or private, car-free. Even the most radical urban designs, like the Superblocks in Barcelona or the Houtman and Utrecht models in the Netherlands, still have a hierarchy of access. You do not tear up the asphalt and plant corn everywhere. You repurpose the space.
So the roads are still there. They just look different?
Yes, precisely. You might have a narrow paved strip for emergency vehicles and delivery vans, but it is surrounded by gardens, bike paths, and walking trails. In a truly car-free district, the only motorized vehicles allowed are ambulances, fire trucks, and essential services. Because there are no private cars clogging up the streets, these emergency vehicles can actually move much faster. Data from the Barcelona Superblocks shows that emergency response times actually improved because there is no traffic for them to fight through.
That is an interesting point. An ambulance in a car-free city is likely to have a much better response time because the road is always clear for them.
Precisely. And for logistics like grocery deliveries, you use microhubs. Large trucks drop off goods at the edge of the car-free zone, and then small electric cargo bikes or automated delivery pods handle the last mile. We are already seeing this in places like Paris and London. It is quieter, safer, and remarkably efficient.
Speaking of Paris, Daniel asked if any countries are pursuing a radical policy to eliminate private transport entirely by 26. We are here in February of 26. What is the state of the world on this? Is anyone actually going all the way?
No country has banned private cars entirely on a national level yet, but the momentum at the city level is staggering. Paris is the poster child for this. As of early 26, their Zone à Trafic Limité, or ZTL, is fully operational, banning most through traffic from the city center. They have turned the banks of the Seine into a park and built hundreds of kilometers of protected bike lanes. They are aiming for a city where the majority of neighborhoods are car-free by 2030.
And Barcelona with the Superblocks. I remember we talked about that briefly before. They are taking clusters of 9 city blocks and pushing all the through traffic to the perimeter, right?
Yes, and the interior streets become shared spaces where pedestrians and cyclists have priority. They have found that in these superblocks, noise levels drop by 20%, air quality improves significantly, and local business actually goes up because people are walking and lingering instead of driving past.
What about the Netherlands? They always seem to be decades ahead on this.
The Netherlands is the gold standard. Cities like Utrecht have built entire new districts like Merwede, designed for 12,000 people to live completely car-free. They have implemented circulation plans that make it physically impossible to drive across the city center. You can drive into a sector to park or drop something off, but if you want to get to the other side of town, you have to go back out to the ring road. Meanwhile, a cyclist or a bus can go straight through the middle. It makes the car the least convenient option for short trips.
So, it is not necessarily about a legal ban, but about design that makes the car obsolete.
That is the most effective way to do it. If you make it easier, faster, and cheaper to take the train or a bike, people will choose that. In Amsterdam, the city is actively removing thousands of parking spaces every year and replacing them with trees and wider sidewalks. They are not saying you cannot own a car. They are just saying we are not going to provide you with a subsidized place to store your private property on public land anymore.
That is a powerful way to frame it. Street parking is essentially a massive subsidy for car owners.
It really is. In many cities, the land value of a single parking spot is worth tens of thousands of dollars, yet we give it away for a few dollars a day or for free. If we reclaim that space for housing, parks, or transit, the math of the city changes completely.
Okay, let us get into the weeds of the remote community issue again, because I think that is where the skepticism is highest. If I live in a rural area and I do not have a car, how do I get my groceries? How do I take my kid to a doctor's appointment 20 miles away? Even with on-demand shuttles, that feels like a lot of friction.
It is friction, but it is a different kind of friction. Right now, the friction is the cost and stress of maintaining a vehicle. In a car-free rural future, the friction is the planning. But here is the thing. As we move further into 26, the technology for autonomous regional transport is finally starting to mature. We are seeing trials of autonomous pods that can travel on existing rural roads.
So it is like a driverless Uber that is part of the public transit system.
Yes. And because you do not have to pay a driver, the operating cost drops by 60 or 70%. That is what makes rural transit viable. You can afford to have a fleet of these pods roaming a rural county because the overhead is so much lower. It becomes a horizontal elevator for the countryside.
A horizontal elevator. I like that. It changes the perspective from a vehicle you own to a service you use. But what about heavy lifting? Farmers, construction workers, people who actually need a truck for their livelihood.
Those are the exceptions that prove the rule. A car-free society does not mean zero four-wheeled vehicles. It means the elimination of the default private commuter car. If you are a plumber, you obviously need your van. If you are a farmer, you need your tractor and your truck. The goal is to get the 90% of people who are just moving themselves from point A to point B out of those giant vehicles.
So it is about right-sizing the transport to the task.
That is it. We use a 2-ton SUV to pick up a liter of milk. It is absurd when you think about it from an engineering perspective. It is like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. If we can move those short, single-person trips to e-bikes, cargo bikes, or microtransit, the entire system breathes.
I wonder about the economic implications. The car industry is a massive part of the global economy. Millions of jobs in manufacturing, sales, repair, insurance. If we actually succeeded in going car-free, wouldn't that cause a massive economic shock?
It would be a massive transition, certainly, but that labor and capital would shift. Instead of building cars, we are building high-speed rail, light rail vehicles, and e-bikes. Instead of gas stations, we have charging hubs and local cafes. Instead of car insurance, Maybe we have more robust health insurance because people are more active and there are fewer accidents. Remember, car crashes are one of the leading causes of death worldwide. The economic cost of those deaths and injuries is trillions of dollars every year.
That is a huge factor. We have just accepted tens of thousands of deaths a year as the price of mobility. It is a pretty grim trade-off when you step back and look at it.
It is. If a new form of transport was introduced today and it killed 40,000 people a year in the United States alone, it would be banned tomorrow. But because it is the car, we have this collective blind spot. A car-free society is, more than anything, a much safer society.
So, let us look at the practical takeaways for someone like Daniel, who is currently fuming in his car on the way to Tel Aviv. What can he do? What can our listeners do to push this forward?
The first thing is to support local transit initiatives. In many cities, transit projects get killed by a vocal minority of residents who are worried about losing parking. We need to be the vocal majority that says, yes, take away the parking, give us a bus lane.
And I think there is a personal element too. Trying to replace even one car trip a week with a bike or a bus. It helps you see the city through a different lens. You notice things you never saw from behind a windshield.
Definitely. And if you are in a position to choose where you live, look for those 15-minute neighborhoods. These are areas where your daily needs, groceries, school, work, parks, are all within a 15-minute walk or bike ride. The more people who choose to live in these areas, the more demand there is for the infrastructure that supports them.
It feels like we are at a tipping point. The frustration Daniel is feeling is being felt by millions of people. The technology is there. The urban planning models are there. It is really a matter of political will and public imagination.
It really is. We have been told for 100 years that the car is freedom. We need to start imagining a different kind of freedom. The freedom to walk down the street and hear birds instead of engines. The freedom for our kids to play outside without us worrying about them being hit by a car. The freedom to travel across the country on a high-speed train while looking at the scenery instead of the bumper in front of us.
That is a vision I can get behind. It is not about taking something away. It is about gaining a better way of living.
Well said, Corn. It is about reclaiming our cities for people. Daniel, I hope the traffic clears up soon, but I also hope that frustration fuels your passion for a better urban future. We really appreciate you sending that in.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And to everyone listening, if you are enjoying these deep dives into the weird and wonderful prompts that come our way, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps more people find this show and join the conversation.
It really does. We love seeing this community grow. You can find all our past episodes, including that one on Vienna we mentioned, at myweirdprompts.com. There is an RSS feed there if you want to subscribe directly, and a contact form if you have a prompt of your own you want us to tackle.
We are also on Spotify, so you can follow us there for the latest episodes. This has been My Weird Prompts. I am.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.